In the depths of the Appalachian Mountains, closed communities were created for generations by geographical isolation. For over 4 decades, the Harrington family lived in absolute secret. Our understanding of the limits of human degradation would be forever changed by what happened on this rural property of 200 acres. Forced by his own father, Jeremiah Harrington, to assume marital responsibilities with his mother, Martha, was Thomas Harrington, just 16 years old in 1943. This was after the patriarch's premature death in a mining accident. What began as a distorted tradition of maintaining pure lineage would turn into the most unimaginable nightmare a family could live. Hidden between century-old oak-covered hills and surrounded by a constant mist that seemed to protect its darker secrets was the Harrington property, 15 kilometers from the nearest city, Pineville. There, far from the eyes of society, 3 generations lived under rules created by the family founder, Ezekiel Harrington, who arrived in the region in 1897 with an obsession for preserving what he called blood purity. Having lost her husband in a collapse in the local coal mine was Martha Harrington, at 34 in 1943. With 5 children to raise and without financial resources, she found herself trapped in the family traditions imposed by her deceased father-in-law. Chosen to assume the role of family protector, a cruel euphemism for what would really happen over the next 20 years, was Thomas, the eldest son. A shy, blue-eyed boy with brown hair, described by the neighbors, young Thomas had no choice. An environment where resistance was impossible was created by the social pressures of the time, combined with geographical isolation and financial dependence. A union that violated all known social and moral norms was what he was forced to accept. During the early years, appearances were managed to be maintained by the family. While Martha took care of her younger children, Thomas worked on the small family farm, cultivating corn and raising some head of cattle. For the few neighbors who occasionally visited the property, they were simply a mother and son struggling to survive after a family tragedy. But much more disturbing was the truth. In 1945, Martha had given birth to her first child with Thomas. A girl was born with severe facial deformities and learning difficulties, who was called Sarah. Physical characteristics that indicated the devastating effects of consanguinity were what she had: very close-set eyes, a cleft palate, and compromised mental development. Born in 1947 was a second child, a boy named David, who developed chronic breathing problems and frequent seizures. More and more evidently, the effects of endogamy began to manifest itself, but the family remained isolated without access to appropriate medical care or external guidance. Make sure you are registered on this channel to discover other equally disturbing cases that have remained hidden for decades. Stories that society preferred to forget, but which need to be told to understand the limits of human degradation. By 1950, 7 years after the beginning of this forced union, the effects of consanguinity on the Harrington family became impossible to ignore. 4 children of Thomas had been given birth to by Martha, now 41, each with deformities and health problems more severe than the previous one. The third child, born in 1949, was Michael, a child who could never walk properly due to malformations in his lower limbs. His legs were disproportionate to his body, and a condition known as syndactyly, common in cases of nearby consanguineous relationships, was what his feet had. Born in 1952 with severe microcephaly was Rebecca, the fourth child. Significantly smaller than normal was her head, indicating compromised brain development. She never learned to talk or feed herself, remaining in a vegetative state throughout her brief life of just 8 years. Signs of mental deterioration began to be shown by Thomas, now 23. The psychological weight of his situation, combined with the pressure to support a family under such adverse conditions, was charging its price. Episodes of erratic behavior were developed by him, alternating between periods of absolute silence and explosions of anger directed at his own children. A scenario of progressive isolation had become the Harrington property. The farm was rarely left by the children, and when they did, hats and clothes that hid their deformed features were worn by them. A rigid control system was developed by Martha, prohibiting any interaction with strangers and keeping the children busy with housework to prevent them from exploring beyond the property limits. In 1953, an unannounced visit to the Harrington farm was made by the pastor of the local church, Reverend William Patterson. What he found left him deeply disturbed. Children with obvious deformities, precarious living conditions, and an environment loaded with tension and fear were what he encountered. The children's conditions were explained by Martha as God's will, but something in the family's behavior alarmed the religious man. A physical resemblance between Thomas and the younger children was noticed by Reverend Patterson, much more than would be expected in a half-brother relationship. More intensely appeared the characteristic blue eyes of the family, and certain birthmarks were statistically impossible in a normal family. During this visit, one of her seizures common in children with severe microcephaly was had by Rebecca. Medical help was offered by the Reverend, but categorically refused by Martha, claiming that doctors did not understand the family's special condition. Even more suspicions about what was really happening on that isolated property were raised by this refusal. Local church records indicate that more visits in the following months were attempted by Reverend Patterson, but the family was always found to be absent or too busy to receive visits. About the Harringtons, the religious community of the region began to murmur, creating theories about family curses and divine punishments. In 1954, the fifth child, James, was born, who presented the most severe set of deformities yet seen in the family. 3 fingers each is what his hands had. Heterochromia, meaning his eyes were different colors, was what he had, and a cardiac condition that severely limited his physical activities was developed by him. James rarely cried or showed emotions, remaining in a state of apathy that worried even Martha. A severe drought to Kentucky was brought by the year 1958, forcing many rural families to seek government help. Finally, having to interact with external authorities was the Harrington family, which had managed to stay isolated for 15 years, when food assistance at the Pineville Social Services office was requested by Martha. The social worker responsible for the case, Dorothy Mills, a 45-year-old experienced woman graduated from the University of Louisville, was immediately alert when she first saw the Harrington children. Consistent with patterns she had studied in cases of consanguinity during her academic training were their physical deformities. Noted by Dorothy was that Sarah, now 13, had not only facial deformities but also a characteristic speech pattern of severe intellectual disability. With difficulty, David, 11, breathed and had frequent fainting episodes. Michael, 9, needed support to walk, and James, 4, remained completely apathetic throughout the interview. During the routine investigation to approve social assistance, inconsistencies in the family documents were discovered by Dorothy. Thomas was listed as the father on the birth records of the youngest children, but a marriage record between Thomas and any woman did not exist. When asked about the children's mother, contradictory and evasive explanations were presented by Martha. Unannounced home visits to evaluate the family's living conditions were decided to be made by the social worker. On her first visit in September 1958, Thomas and Martha were found by her sharing the same room, while the 5 children slept in a room without proper ventilation. A marital relationship between mother and son was clearly suggested by the configuration of the house. About the situation, Martha was confronted by Dorothy, but only vehement denials and threats that the family would move if she continued to be persecuted were received. However, enough had been seen by the social worker to suspect she was facing a case of consanguinity and child neglect. It was during this investigation that something even more disturbing was discovered by Dorothy. Talking to James, the 4-year-old, a sentence he had heard from the adults was repeated: "Dad Thomas is Mom Martha's brother." The social worker's suspicions about the true nature of the family relationship were confirmed by this innocent revelation from a child. You realize that some secrets are too heavy to be buried the moment you hear an innocent child repeat words that reveal the horror of your own existence. Leave a comment telling which part of this story has most impacted you so far. Immediately contacted by Dorothy Mills was local Sheriff Robert Kane, a 52-year-old man who had served the community for over 2 decades. When she shared her discovery with the sheriff, initial resistance to believing the severity of the situation was shown by him. In rural communities, cases of consanguinity were whispered about, but they were rarely officially investigated. However, too convincing to be ignored was the evidence presented by Dorothy. A disturbing picture that demanded immediate investigation was painted by the children's deformities combined with the domestic configuration and James's innocent statement. In October 1958, a search warrant to officially investigate the Harrington property was obtained by Sheriff Robert Kane. Accompanied by social worker Dorothy Mills and county doctor Dr. Henry Morrison, they arrived at the farm on a hazy morning that seemed to mirror the dark atmosphere they would find. Graduated from the University of Kentucky School of Medicine and with experience in basic genetics, Dr. Morrison was critical for documenting the children's conditions. A consistent pattern of congenital malformations he described as textbook examples of inbreeding depression was revealed by his exam. Sarah, now 13, had not only severe facial deformities but also progressive scoliosis that was compromising her respiratory capacity. Documented by Dr. Morrison was that her mental age corresponded approximately to that of a 6-year-old child, and she had developed repetitive behaviors characteristic of autistic spectrum disorders. Diagnosed with a congenital cardiac condition that severely limited his life expectancy was David, at age 11. His lungs were underdeveloped, and episodes of cyanosis, a bluish skin color indicative of inadequate blood oxygenation, were had by him. Without medical intervention, David would not live beyond 15 years, was estimated by Dr. Morrison. So severe were Michael's, 9 years old, bone malformations that multiple surgeries were recommended by Dr. Morrison, surgeries that were simply not available in Kentucky's rural medicine in 1958. Different lengths were what his legs were, and his hips were misaligned in a way that caused constant pain. The most complex set of medical problems was had by James, the youngest at 4. In addition to visible physical deformities, mild hydrocephalus, an accumulation of fluid in the brain, was found in him by Dr. Morrison, which explained his extremely limited mental development and constant apathy. During the investigation, the true nature of her relationship with Thomas was finally confessed by Martha under legal pressure and in the face of irrefutable medical evidence. That she had been forced by circumstances and family traditions to maintain a union with her own son after her husband's death in 1943 was admitted by her. Obvious signs of psychological deterioration were had by Thomas, now 31. Between periods of lucidity, where he expressed deep remorse for his situation, and episodes of mental confusion, where he seemed not to completely understand what had happened to his life, he alternated during his testimony. Also revealed by the investigation was that Martha had suffered multiple miscarriages over the years, a common consequence of nearby consanguinity. That, considering the 5 children who survived, Martha had probably been pregnant at least 10 times, with half of the pregnancies resulting in natural losses due to genetic incompatibilities, was estimated by Dr. Morrison. Regional attention was gained by the case when stories about Kentucky's most isolated family were published by Louisville newspapers. Between those who expressed compassion for the family's tragic situation and others who showed revulsion and demanded severe punishment, the local community was divided. In December 1958, the Bell County Court decided the children should be separated from their parents. In different care institutions for children with severe disabilities were placed Sarah, David, Michael, and James. 2 years earlier, due to complications related to her microcephaly, Rebecca had died. In January 1959, to 15 years in prison for crimes against morals and morality, a legal terminology of the time that encompassed incestuous relationships, was sentenced Thomas Harrington. A 10-year sentence was received by Martha, but due to her condition as a victim of circumstances, only 4 years in a psychiatric institution were served by her. One of the most documented cases of consanguinity in 20th-century American medical literature became the fate of the Harringtons. Admitted to Danville State Hospital was Sarah, where she remained until her death in 1967 at the age of 22 due to respiratory complications related to her congenital deformities. As predicted by Dr. Morrison, David died in 1962 at age 15 during experimental heart surgery at the University of Louisville. Medical studies on the cardiovascular effects of close consanguinity were contributed to by his death, helping scientific knowledge about inbreeding. Until he was 25, Michael lived, remaining in specialized institutional care. Despite his severe physical limitations, some basic communication skills were developed by him, and affection for his caregivers was shown by him. His death in 1974 was caused by kidney complications related to his congenital malformations. Surprised were doctors when James, the youngest, lived until he was 31, dying in 1985. Although he never developed mental abilities beyond those of a 3-year-old child, some quality of life was found by him at a specialized institution where appropriate care in his life was first received by him. After the family's arrest, the Harrington property was abandoned. The wooden house rapidly deteriorated, and the land that had witnessed so much suffering began to be reclaimed by nature. Only the stone foundations remain visible today, covered with dense vegetation that hides the physical traces of this tragedy. The social assistance policies in Kentucky were significantly influenced by the Harrington case. A national child rights defender became Dorothy Mills, the social worker who discovered the case, and she helped establish more rigorous protocols to identify cases of neglect and consanguineous relationships in isolated rural communities. From prison in 1967, Thomas was released, but he was never able to reintegrate into society. The last years of his life were spent by him in a small boarding house in Louisville, working manual jobs and avoiding social contact. He died in 1983 at the age of 56 from alcoholism-related liver cirrhosis, a form of escape he had found to deal with the trauma of his own life. After her release in 1963, Martha moved to a small town in Tennessee, where a new identity was taken on by her. As a housekeeper until her retirement, she worked, and she died in 1979, taking her secrets to the grave. After leaving the psychiatric institution, she never had contact with any of her surviving children. Important research on the effects of consanguinity in isolated human populations has been contributed to by the Harrington scientific legacy. Early identification protocols for endogamy-related malformations have been helped to be established by medical studies on the children, and they have influenced public health policies in rural communities. A dark reminder of how isolation, distorted traditions, and extreme circumstances can lead whole families to the deepest degradation remains this case. The highest possible price for traditions that prioritized blood purity over basic human well-being was paid by the Harrington family. If you have watched this far, it is because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here, so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel." Subscribe to discover other equally disturbing cases that have remained hidden for decades. Leave your like if this story has impacted you, and share so that more people may know these accounts that society preferred to forget, but which need to be told to understand the limits of the human condition.